Well, welcome again. And now we have the honor to be visited by Senator Ben Sasse from Nebraska, the Cornhusker state. The senator was born in Plainview, Nebraska. Now, some of you may not know where that is, but it's kind of in the northeast corner of Nebraska. Some people call it God's country out there by Iowa and, of course, South Dakota up there. So we're happy to have the senator with us. He holds a bachelor's degree from Harvard, a master's from St. John's, master's and doctoral degrees from Yale. He also taught at the University of Texas. He's got 2 books out. The most recent one called Why Do We Hate Each Other, I believe is the title, and was prescient. It came out in 2018. He's on very important committees in the United States Senate, not to say that some are not important. They're all important, but he is on the Intelligence Committee, the Judiciary Committee, the Finance Committee, and the Budget Committee. And so he's kind of looking at the future of work, the future maybe of war, international relations, and of course the Constitution. So, and I would end by saying the senator is one of only 7 Republican senators to vote in favor of President Trump's impeachment earlier this year. So with that, Senator, you're involved with all of our stuff. Would you like to make an opening comment or anything, or should we just get right into it?
I think, Jeff, you should lead us, but thanks for having me, and greetings to your 250, 300 folks that are part of this meeting. Wish we were breaking bread together in person, but I'm glad to get some time with you. And when you said where Plainview is, we're spitting distance from South Dakota. So I know your old stomping grounds right across the border from where I was a little kid.
Yeah, well, great, Senator. Okay, well, let's talk about it. Obviously, a top of mind issue is the infrastructure situation and whether a bill will be done, whether it will be 2 bills, whether it will be bipartisan or what. How do you see this all breaking down? What are your priorities? You're on finance and budget. Those are obviously big committees for this. How do you see the infrastructure debate going, and what timing maybe do you see on it?
Yeah, so I'll come back to some of what my top priorities are, but first I'll do just a tiny bit of prognostication. I do think that it's important to recognize that DC plays these Orwellian language games a lot, and a real infrastructure bill, I actually think, could draw quite a bit of bipartisan support. But right now, we live in a world where people often use words because they think they'll be effective for the way the media will cover their story. And the infrastructure bill, I put it in scare quotes, that the administration came out with a couple of months ago, when you actually go through the bill, it's only about 37% infrastructure. And this follows on a spring effort where COVID relief package 4.5 or maybe 5, whatever number we want to call the bundling of different pandemic spending that DC's been doing over the last 15 months. That bill was called emergency COVID funding, but it was actually only 8% emergency COVID. It was more than 8% COVID, but emergency being defined as being spent inside the current calendar year, as opposed to waiting for the annual appropriations process. Only about 8% of the total spending of that $2 trillion-ish bill, $2 trillion-ish bill, only 8% of that was emergency COVID, and they kind of got away with it. And so now you see all these people trying to take priorities that are not infrastructure related and load them into this same bill. So they've made up these categories like human infrastructure. But really the bill that the administration has introduced is only about 3/8 infrastructure. And I don't think that bill has much of a chance of getting through in its current form. There's been a lot of, DC ping pong the last couple of days as President Biden, right before he headed for Europe, kind of broke up with Shelley Moore Capito and then started up a new flirtation with Bill Cassidy, 2 of the more moderate members of my conference. And so he went from saying he was negotiating with Republicans to he was negotiating with a 20-ish person bipartisan task force that's kind of the new Cassidy group. As your members know, it takes 60 votes to get anything done in DC under regular order. It only takes 51 votes to pass a piece of legislation, but it takes a 3/5 vote to end debate and get to that vote. And so if you can't get to 60, then you have to use this reconciliation tool, which traditionally has been available when there's alignment between a Senate majority and an administration. That tool has been available once a year. The parliamentarian has made some new rulings recently that make it conceivable that you could get a second or even given a third bite at the apple in the course of a year. But in a 50-50 divided Senate, where Kamala Harris as vice president would be the tiebreaker in the Senate, you'd need every Democrat. So if you can't get to a 60-vote bipartisan bill, you'd need every Democrat plus the vice president to get you across the finish line. And I think that Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema as well, and maybe 3 or 4 Democrats that are a little quieter, but are also pretty uncomfortable with the leftward lurch of a lot of the Democratic Party right now. Manchin in particular, I think, is unwilling to do a single party only infrastructure bill that includes massive tax increases on any quick timeline. So to your question, is there a prospect? I think there are 3 parts here. Is there a prospect at a bipartisan infrastructure bill? There is, but it's probably more in the 500 billion to $1 trillion price tag point as opposed to multi-trillion. Number 2, there's a question of what its duration is. Is it over the course of 5 years or is it 8 to 10 years? And what are the pay-fors inside that? Are there massive tax increases, or are there user fees that essentially try to finance it as you go over the course of that 5 to 10 year window? And number 3 is the process, if not a 60-vote bipartisan bill, is there a reconciliation bill that can go fast? I don't think there's one that can go fast, because it is possible that the administration plus only the Democrats in the Senate could get something done. But I think they'd go through a winnowing process, as Joe Manchin would force them to be a lot more deliberative about, is the stuff that's in it actually infrastructure or not?
Great insight, Senator. And you raised a couple of things. One was the $2 trillion-ish bill that was done earlier this year on top of last year's, which, by the way, were very, very helpful to action about a year ago on the PPP, and other things were critical, and we thank you for that. But what we're seeing now, by the way, is some of these funds that have been allocated by Congress are not getting to people for use in rental assistance or to businesses and so forth. And I just raised that for you. By the way, labor issues and getting workers back is of importance to us. I believe that you're focused on this and have legislation on to encourage signing bonuses or something to bring people back. Do you want to talk a minute about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So I do think that last year's COVID relief packages were, better than average for a lot of the sloppiness that becomes the rule of the day in DC about when legislation is moving fast. But I still think a lot of the labor provisions were very poorly thought out. And it's just sort of a 101 principle. I don't think we should ever create a disincentive to work where we're paying people more money to stay out of the labor force than to be in the labor force. Obviously, one of the fundamental reasons you work is you need to put bread on the table for your family. But one of the other reasons you work is because we're created with dignity and we're meant to live lives of gratitude by doing productive stuff that benefits our neighbor. We're meant to have callings. We're meant to sort of live out the dignity of work. We're not just consumers. We're meant to be productive. And I think that one of the stupid things that was done in this legislation is there was a pandemic unemployment insurance bonus paid that got it to a place where in a lot of states, you had 50 and 60% of workers making more on unemployment than they had ever made in employed situations over the course of their life. And so I'm not making an argument that folks are lazy. I'm making an argument that folks respond to incentives. And so one of the reasons that a lot of restaurants have gone bankrupt in America over the course of the last 6 months is not just because many of the lockdowns were heavy-handed and not poorly thought out, but also because we created a real disincentive for people to go back to work when you told them that if they leave unemployment, the bonus unemployment insurance that was being paid, and go back to work, they'd have to take a massive pay cut to go back to work. That's really bad policy. And so right now, the current supplement on unemployment insurance lasts till about Labor Day. It's been extended twice. And when you created this incentive, there are a whole bunch of people, and I've experienced it on both the employer and the employee side in my state repeatedly. I live in Nebraska and I commute every week. And so I'm home in rural Nebraska on weekends. And I've learned from lots of people that there are folks who want to go back to work, but they just think they can't afford to take the pay cut of what it would cost them to give up the supplemental unemployment insurance benefits. You've seen some states now start to cut the supplemental payment, which is now down to $300 a week on top of the baseline unemployment insurance that exists. So in certain states, you don't have that supplemental. Started in South Carolina, then went to Iowa. Another number of other states like mine have now looked at a similar policy. But the federal policy is still to have this big subsidy on top of the traditional unemployment insurance. My legislation, the National Signing Bonus Act, essentially says we're not getting to bipartisan agreement about ending this right now. I wish we would once you saw the economic recovery shifting into full gear a couple of months ago. But at the very least, we shouldn't give people this perverse choice where when they want to go back to work, they have to take a pay cut to do it. And so my legislation essentially tries to shift 2 months of the supplemental unemployment insurance benefit that people would have gotten on top of regular unemployment insurance if they stayed unemployed. And instead, if they go back to work, they get it as a signing bonus played out over day 1, day 31, and day 61 when they're back on the job.
Thank you for that. I know your time is so we're going to zip through a couple of things. You mentioned incentives, and you don't have to respond to this, but I just want to say it. You know, obviously some of the tax pay-fors on the table regarding capital gain, or in the real estate case, like-kind exchanges and so forth, really are a disincentive for assets to move, for properties to move, and we certainly hope that will not occur, at least to the extent that the Biden administration is proposing. I would also say housing. You know, you're on the banking committee. We'll be coming to you to talk about housing and our ideas on how to help housing. And we have one other item that we'll be bringing to your attention: pandemic risk insurance. The committee will be dealing with that. But let's move on the Intelligence Committee. We are highly concerned, like all Americans are, about international issues. You were recently told on the Intelligence Committee, I believe, that Russia, Iran, and China in particular were creating, worrisome situations. What kind of comments do you have on that? And then also maybe cybersecurity, and the ransomware issues.
Yeah, so maybe 3 thoughts here. One, I'll give a top line of the around the world of the biggest 5 threats we face. The second is what we see in particular in cyber and the long-term miniaturization, digitalization of war as we move toward gray space war. And then third, I'll make a comment on ransomware in particular. I'm one of 8 or 9 people out of 100 people in the Senate who's never been a politician until doing this 6 years ago. And when I first got here, it was standard fare. I used to travel a lot with John McCain to war zones, and it was standard that if you'd say, let's look at the hotspots around the world, what are we worried about from a national security and an intelligence perspective, there were always 5 issues. There was never 2, and there were never 20. There were 5. There was Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and a grab bag of jihadis. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and a bunch of jihadis. Today, when you ask people in the national security space, if you talk to the heads of our intelligence community, if you talk to the top brass at the Pentagon, and you say, what's keeping you up at night? Pretty much everybody says China, 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 China. The long-term technology race with China is with the Chinese Communist Party. Obviously, the Chinese people are not our enemy, but the Chinese Communist Party leadership, the long-term technology race with them is an existential threat, the likes of which we haven't seen since the late 40s, early 50s at the rise of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And so we are not at all prepared for the pace of change and the digital revolution coming to the future of war that we need to be paying attention to, that we need to be upgrading our national security investments for. There will never be a standalone kinetic war among first world powers. There are only going to be cyber wars or hybrid wars, by which I mean kinetic wars, but that are accompanied by massive gray space information operation wars and with lots of cyber attacks against critical infrastructure. In the United States, and your members know this well, 86% of all critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector in the United States. And so obviously we have massive defensive challenges in a world where cyber attack can take the form of what you see. There's a border skirmish going on between China and India right now. And so China goes in and regularly flickers the lights on and off in the utilities of India, just to let the Indians understand that China could mess with almost all of their nominally private sector infrastructure, or non-war space, non-war domain, war target infrastructure. And so what you see happening with the ransomware attacks is a next step of, it's almost like, I'm the son of a football coach, and it's almost like as football evolves, offenses often evolve in ways that the defense takes a while to figure out how you're going to play combat against this new offensive arsenal. Right now, cyber war is so much easier to go on offense in than anything we're ready to play defense on yet. And in Russia, what you have is you have 16 different sectors of the economy where a Putin crony, where an oligarch essentially runs what used to be a public sector of the economy that was privatized and not in a healthy democratic capitalist way, but to just be run by one big bad corrupt dude. Most of these 16 oligarchs have experimented with private intelligence services, and they allow a lot of their workers to essentially go out and do cyber crime on the side using tools they learned at the office, and then to hold hostage these ransomware attacks. I know we're almost at time here, so I've said a bunch of negative stuff in this answer. I want to say something positive. The FBI had a big win this week, or that we went public this week with it, which is that the Colonial Pipeline attack, where the ransom payment was just shy of $5 million. There's been a cryptocurrency decline in the time since then, but essentially the FBI was able, and I'm not crossing a classified line here, I'm only speaking in broad brushstrokes about stuff that's been reported in the media, but they were able to basically get back into that digital wallet after the ransom was paid and seize back most of those funds. There were some transaction fees that were lost. There's been a currency rate change. So the number you see in the papers isn't the same as the ransom that was paid, but this is the kind of upgrading of our cyber offense that we're going to need to be able to execute against for the new face of digital and hybrid war that we see.
Senator, thank you. I know your time is precious, so I'll let you go. Even though I want to ask you about your views on politics today, your views on just partisan activities. I invite you to say something on that if you'd like, but I understand if you've got to run.
I'll wrap within 60 seconds because I have an intelligence committee hearing about to start. But I guess the main thing I would say is that we're going to need to do civics better for 330 million people. So we have more one cheer for politics kind of folks. What's happening right now is what I would call the tyranny of the addicts, meaning that our politics is becoming responsive only to the very, very narrow group of people that have decided to make politics their primary community. And I'm the third or fourth most conservative guy in the Senate by voting record, but I'm just dispositionally moderate because I don't think politics is the center of the world. And the vast majority of Americans agree with me and agree with the folks that are on this call, on this Zoom at your conference, in that politics makes really crappy community. Politics is supposed to maintain a framework for ordered liberty so your folks can go out and build the future and build great properties and build the Rotary Club and churches and synagogues and schools and little leagues. The really interesting stuff in America happens locally where your friends are and where you break bread and where you build a business. The really interesting stuff in America isn't supposed to be Washington, D.C. And yet we've got a small number of addicts that have kind of taken over politics on this instant feedback loop of 24/7 provocateur grandstanding politics. And I mean, DC is just Hollywood for ugly people. And it really should be a servant community of places where folks come to serve for a limited time, but then try to get back home. And right now we're dominated by two political parties that really don't have a lot of actual market share, but they have deep tribal loyalty among the small group of people that have made politics primary in their life. And that was never really the founder's vision for how a republic was supposed to function.
Thank you. We'll let you go. I know there's a lot of friends of yours watching. They're happy to see you, but I also know you made a lot of new friends today. Thank you for your time, and go to the intelligence briefing. We would never hold you up for that, sir. And we look forward to working with you and continuing the dialogue. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Jeff. Great to be with you.
Thank you.